Hello and welcome back, guys. Today we're going to take a look at my personal raid setup for Surgeblade. Currently we don't have really high level raids available, so this is again an entry level guide just explaining the basics and what setup I'm using and why I'm using it, right? Later on I'll have footage of an actual Guardian raid that I do solo if you're interested in that. Okay, so just to explain the Surge really quickly, the way it works is every time you use an ability while you use your identity, you get a buff. You get a stacking buff up until 20 stacks, which will enhance your next activation of the identity. And if you have it further set up, which in this case I have level 3 Surge, it also gives you an attack power buff. And on top of that, depending on how many stacks you use, you will also recover a certain amount of your identity afterwards. So I'll show you just how this works really quickly. So you activate it, and then, for example, I use my death sentence here, and as you can see, it slowly stacks up 5 stacks of that buff. This buff maxes out at 20 stacks, but you don't have to necessarily reactivate at 20 stacks, simply because if you're at 14 stacks, this will also recover 3 energy balls again. So if I activate it here, as you can see, it recovers a little bit of my identity again up until 3 balls, which is normally when you will want to use it again. Although that being said, I wouldn't recommend using it right at 14 stacks. I would try to get some more unless you can't. But once you, like, anything above 14 stacks or at 14 stacks is fine. So as you saw, depending on how many stacks you have, not only does it buff your second activation of your identity, and if you have more stacks, the entire attack power of your class, but on top of that, once you reach around 14 identity stacks, it recovers up to 3 balls, which is what you want. So depending on how many stacks you have, like for example, if I activate it here on, I don't know, let's do it on 5 stacks, you can see that I gain a significantly less amount of recovered identity again, which is not even 1 ball on 5 stacks. So as I said, if you have 14 or more stacks, reactivation is pretty good. So now let's talk about why I play the build that I do, and you know what that does. So let's start with the top. Spin cutter, obviously, as always, this is the synergy, gives me 3% damage bonus and my party members, and 9% on frontal and back attacks, which is very important because your identity second activation, as you can see right here, is actually a back attack. So having that up before you use your burst the second time is very important. Then on top of that, we have Dark Axle, which is probably the best movement option Blade has, but probably, I mean, 100%. You have Tenacity or Corkscrew here, if depending on how much what you want. Tenacity is way easier to use because it just gives you tier 2 super armor in your mobility, which is really nice to get out of tricky situations. On top of that, we have Soul Absorber. You can play different setups here, either Swift Fingers or Concussion. Some bosses require you to have a higher stagger level, so sometimes going into Concussion is good, but generally speaking, Swift Fingers is obviously easier to use, and it does a significant amount of damage. Also, it has Destruction on it, which is really nice on a lot of bosses as well. Now let's talk about Death Sentence, which is kind of my own little twist to this build. I also play the Bleed rune on it, which is important to note, with the Cold Zone, and here it also depends what boss fight you're playing. Normally mobility is really nice, but as I said, if you need weak point, which is Destruction on some bosses, this is also very, very useful. And also later on, I will spec into Critical Blow at some point as well. Although Explosion gives you 1 more stack, it's way harder to get off because it takes longer, right? But for now, I will just run with this because, you know, Destruction is good on some bosses, although the mobility is also nice. So let's just run with this for now, and I'll show you what it does. So as you saw earlier already, in your burst, you want to get as many stacks as possible. If I use Death Sentence now and the boss actually stands still, not only do I get 5 stacks just from that ability, but on top of that I only needed to use it once, and the bleed gets reapplied of my rune. And as you can see right here, every time the Cold Zone ticks, the bleed is reapplied as well. So having bleed on this ability is also really, really nice. So let's talk about Earth Cleaver, which is your only counter. And this is important because this ability you can literally run on 0 points even, or 4 points, but in my current setup I have it with Earth Explosion because it's easier to set up, and I also think the damage is okay. But you don't have to run this on 10 points whatsoever, even on 4 points, just with a 4-meter mobility is nice. And as I said again, if you need high stagger level, this is also an option right here. Now what this does is basically when the boss glows blue and does a little charge animation and you hit the boss on the head, you actually stagger the boss, so basically CC the boss, which is very, very nice, especially if you play solo or in a group. Honestly, in both situations it's very nice. You will see me doing that in the very beginning of the raid footage later, so stick around so you can see what it actually does. I don't think I have to explain Moonlight Sonic again. It's just a great ability and it gives you 3 burst stacks. Let me reset that again. It gives you 3 stacks right here, as you can see. Good range, good damage, good AoE. Can't go wrong with that. Maelstrom is also the normal setup as always. On top of that, I also have a bleed rune on that because it does reapply it as well every time it ticks. So it's kind of nice to just have that on it. If you have like a low level bleed rune or something, just having it on that ability is not bad. Also something that I forgot to mention, actually, on Spin Cutter I'm using Rage, which has a chance to actually increase my attack and movement speed, which is really important. And on Soul Absorber I'm using skill cast speed. But I will make a more in-depth guide once I get to tier 3 and once my build is a little bit more fleshed out. We talked about Axel, we talked about all of these, and now we talk about Void Strike. Void Strike I'm using a little bit of cast speed, not too much though. That may be changed and may be changing in the future, but the setup is Swift Fingers, Void Zone, and Dark Dimension, which is actually one of the craziest stacking abilities for your burst. As you can see, if I use the entire ability here, plus the Void Zone, it gives me up to 7 stacks, which is incredible for one ability. But there's also one more thing I want to mention here, because there's a little trick that you can do if you spec into Dark Dimension, and that is just getting it off very quickly, and the Void Zone, which is this tripod here, will apply instantly. So you don't actually have to go through the entire duration of the ability to get the Void Zone up. So you can basically opt in or out. Does the boss attack me right now? Can I charge it fully? If you can't charge it fully, no problem. The Void Zone will still apply and you will still get a good amount of stacks from that. Just one more thing to mention. If you don't like Death Sentence, there's also an ability called Wind Cut that you can opt into. We talked about that in the Chaos Dungeon video for a little bit, which also gives you a good amount of stacks. I would probably play with Quick Preparation, Sustain Enhancement, and Thick Sword Energy, because this is the most, well, easy setup to get this off. This is also an option in this build, and a lot of very meta builds play Wind Cut just for the very easy low cooldown stacking ability. And last but not least, I will just mention the ultimate really quick. The Flash Blink is just way easier to use and does a lot of damage as well. Just make sure that you have your 3% damage buff up, and most of the time you use it actually to get a good amount of identity charged up in the first place, so you can go into your burst earlier. And yeah, and now I will show you a quick footage, well, of the Frost Helgaia raid. I'm a little bit overgeared for that, and I definitely didn't play that super well, but I think it still showcases the build pretty well and what I'm trying to do with it. And as I said, there's a lot of variation in Blade builds, including the Surge build, so I would encourage you to try out things out for yourself a little bit as well. And once we get to tier 3, which should be soon, I will make a more advanced setup for Surge as well. So yeah, have a good one, guys, and see you in the next one. Good luck and have fun with the build, and see you on Twitch maybe. Peace.